January 1946. Yokohama, Japan. The winter air hung cold and thin over the ruined port city. Through streets lined with skeletal buildings and charred timber frames, a young Japanese woman walked with measured steps toward the American administrative headquarters, established in a requisitioned bank building. Her name was Tanaka Michiko, 23 years old. University-educated before the war forced the closure of her women's college. She wore a worn but carefully pressed navy skirt and white blouse, the closest approximation to professional attire she could assemble from what remained of her family's possessions. In her leather satchel, carefully protected by cloth wrapping, she carried the documents certifying her fluency in English and her appointment as a civilian translator for the occupation forces. She had been summoned. Not ordered in the imperial sense she understood, but requested through a formal letter that used the word please. The strangeness of that single word had kept her awake the previous night. In her entire life under the militarist regime, no official document had ever asked anything of her with courtesy. Commands came from above, flowing downward through rigid channels of hierarchy that permitted no questioning, no dialogue, no consideration of what those below might think or feel or know. Women especially existed in a sphere of service to father, to husband, to emperor, to nation where their thoughts remained unspoken and their opinions. Yunuska. Now she climbed the steps of the occupation headquarters, her worn shoes clicking against stone still bearing scorch marks from the firebombing raids. At the entrance, an American military police officer, possibly tall, possibly young, held the door open for her and said, "Good morning, ma'am." The simple courtesy struck her like a physical blow. He had addressed her with respect. He had opened a door for her. He had looked at her face, not past her, not through her, but at her, as though she existed as an individual worthy of acknowledgement. Inside, the building hummed with activity, but not the harsh barking orders and rigid formality she expected. Americans moved with casual efficiency, speaking to one another in tones that seemed to lack the sharp edges of military hierarchy. A female officer in uniform, a woman wearing lieutenant's bar, strode past carrying files, her presence unremarkable to the men around her. Mikuko had never seen a female military officer in her life. The very concept seemed to violate natural law as she had been taught to understand it. She was directed to a conference room where 3 American officers awaited her, 2 men and 1 woman. They stood when she entered. They stood for her. The senior officer, a colonel with graying temples, gestured to a chair and asked, not commanded, if she would sit. Then, through the formality of introduction and explanation of her duties, something happened that would fracture every assumption about power, gender, and human worth that 23 years under Japanese militarism had constructed in her mind. The colonel leaned forward and said, "Miss Tanaka, we need to establish women's affairs bureaus in the prefecture offices. You've worked with Japanese women's organizations before the war. What do you think would be the most effective approach?" The question hung in the air. Michiko felt her breath catch. She glanced around the room, searching for the trick, the trap, the hidden subordinate clause that would reveal this as some kind of test of obedience. But the 3 officers simply waited, their attention focused on her, their expressions patient and genuinely expectant. They wanted to know what she thought, not what she had been told to think, not what the official position should be. They wanted her opinion, drawn from her experience, her knowledge, her individual perspective, as though such things had value. Her mouth had gone dry. In her entire life, no man in authority had ever asked her opinion about anything beyond household management. Her father had told her what to study. The imperial education system had told her what to think. The Patriotic Women's Association had told her how to serve. And now, in defeat, in occupation, in the ruins of everything she had been taught to revere, these foreign conquerors were asking her, skiing what, she thought. This was the moment that began to reshape not just Tanaka Michiko, but thousands of Japanese women like her in the most unexpected transformation of the Pacific War's aftermath. The clash between Japanese militarist ideology and American democratic values would manifest, not primarily on battlefields already silent, but in offices, schools, and administrative buildings where women discovered that their thoughts, their voices, their very existence as thinking individuals, were being acknowledged for the first time. To understand the seismic nature of this moment, one must understand the ideological chasm separating the treatment of women in militarist Japan from the American approach that shocked Michiko and her contemporaries. The gap was not merely wide, was fundamental, touching the deepest assumptions about human nature, social organization, and the proper ordering of civilization itself. Japanese militarism in the 1930s and 1940s had codified the subordination of women into a totalizing ideology that penetrated every aspect of society. The concept of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, defined the entire scope of female existence. Women existed to serve men, to produce children for the empire, and to support the war effort through sacrifice and obedience. The 1898 Civil Code, still in full force during the war, placed women under the legal authority of their fathers before marriage and their husbands after. Women could not enter contracts, own property independently, or make decisions about their own children without male permission. The education system reinforced this subordination with mathematical precision. Girls' schools emphasized domestic skills, moral training in submission, and just enough literacy to manage household accounts and read imperial rescripts. Higher education for women existed in limited form, but even university-educated women found themselves channeled into narrow roles as teachers of young children or nurses, extensions of the maternal function deemed natural to their sex. The idea that a woman might contribute intellectual labor to questions of policy, administration, or governance was so foreign to the system as to be almost unthinkable. During the war years, this ideological structure intensified. The government mobilized women for factory work, agricultural labor, and support services, but always within a framework that emphasized sacrifice for men at the front. The Patriotic Women's Association, with its millions of members, organized women's contributions to the war effort, but the organization itself was directed entirely by male bureaucrats. Women assembled care packages, grew vegetables, worked in munitions plants, and endured deprivation, but they did so as objects of national policy, not as participants in its formation. Military women's auxiliary corps existed, but operated under severe restrictions. The women who served performed clerical work, nursing, and communications duties, but held no command authority and received no combat training. They wore uniforms but remained civilians, their service characterized as an extension of domestic duty rather than true military participation. The concept of female officers with command authority over men was so antithetical to Japanese military culture that it had no conceptual vocabulary to describe such a thing. That system rested on ideological foundations, drawn from a particular interpretation of Confucian social hierarchy, combined with modern totalitarian efficiency. Women's subordination was presented not as oppression, but as natural order, as harmony, as the proper functioning of a society aligned with cosmic principle. To question this order was to question reality itself. And so most women did not question it because they had been given no language, no framework, no examples that might allow them to imagine anything different. Then came defeat. Total, absolute, undeniable defeat. The Emperor's radio broadcast on August 15, 1945, announcing Japan's surrender, shattered more than military morale. It cracked the entire ideological edifice that had claimed divine sanction and historical inevitability. If the system had been right, how had it led to such catastrophic failure? If the military hierarchy had been natural and proper, why had it resulted in cities burned to ash and millions dead? If unquestioning obedience had been the path to national glory, why had that path led to subjugation under foreign occupation? Into this fractured landscape came the Americans, carrying with them ideas about human rights, individual dignity, and democratic participation that seemed. Two Japanese women raised under militarism, almost incomprehensibly alien. The occupation authorities, operating under directives from Washington, emphasizing democratization and demilitarization, identified women's rights as central to preventing future Japanese militarism. The reasoning was strategic as much as moral, a society that suppressed half its population, that denied voice and agency to women, was more susceptible to totalitarian control, teaching women to think for themselves, to participate in civic life, to claim their rights as individuals, would create a population more resistant to future militaristic manipulation. But between policy directive and actual implementation lay an enormous gap of cultural assumption and daily practice. American officers arriving in Japan brought with them, often unconsciously, habits of gender interaction forged in a very different society. The United States in 1945 was hardly a paradise of gender. Quali women had only gained the vote 25 years earlier. Workplace discrimination remained standard practice, and social expectations still constrained women's choices severely. Yet compared to militarist Japan, American gender norms operated on fundamentally different premises. American women could own property, enter contracts, divorce abusive husbands, attend universities in significant numbers, and increasingly work in professional roles. Female military officers, though still facing discrimination and limited opportunities, nonetheless existed and held real authority. More fundamentally, American democratic ideology, however imperfectly realized in practice, rested on a concept of individual rights that transcended gender. The notion that each person possessed inherent dignity, that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed, that free speech and free thought were inalienable rights. These principles, when taken seriously, made no exception for women. An American officer who genuinely believed in democratic values would find it natural, even necessary, to ask subordinates regardless of gender for their input, to consider their perspectives, to treat them as thinking individuals rather than mere instruments of policy. This cultural difference, carried into daily interactions during the occupation, created moments of cognitive dissonance so profound that Japanese women who experienced them described feeling as though the fundamental nature of reality had shifted. Tanaka Michiko was not alone in her experience. Across occupied Japan in late 1945 and early 1946, thousands of Japanese women found themselves recruited as translators, secretaries, clerks, and administrative assistants for the occupation forces. The Americans needed Japanese speakers desperately, and educated Japanese women, barred from most professional roles before the war, nonetheless often possessed strong foreign language skills. Women's colleges had emphasized English and other European languages as culturally enriching accomplishments for future wives of elite men. These women entered American offices expecting the same treatment they had known under Japanese authority: to be given orders, to execute tasks silently and efficiently, to remain invisible as thinking beings. Instead, they encountered behavior that seemed to violate every social norm they understood. Hamada Yoko, a 27-year-old translator working in the Civil Information and Education section in Tokyo, recorded in her diary an incident from January 1946 that captured this disorientation. An American lieutenant, reviewing documents about education reform, turned to her and asked, "What was it like in Japanese girls' schools before the war? Were you taught history? Science?" She answered factually, describing the emphasis on domestic training and moral education. He pressed further, Did you want to learn more than they taught you? Did you feel the curriculum was adequate? She wrote that night, I did not know how to answer because I had never been asked to evaluate my own education. It had simply been what it was, given by authority, accepted without question. To be asked whether I thought it adequate implied that my judgment of such things mattered. The concept seemed dangerous and thrilling in equal measure. The danger was real. Women who began to believe their opinions mattered, who started to think critically about their own experiences, were implicitly rejecting the entire social order that had defined them. They were claiming a kind of authority over their own lives that the militarist system had never granted. Yet the Americans seemed not only to permit this claim, but to encourage it, to insist upon it as necessary for the democratic transformation they sought in offices throughout occupied Japan. Women discovered that American supervisors expected them to point out errors in documents, to suggest improvements in procedures, to explain cultural contexts that Americans misunderstood. They were expected to think, to analyze, to contribute intellectually rather than simply execute orders. More shocking still, when their suggestions proved valuable, they received acknowledgement and thanks. Their contributions were credited. Their names appeared on reports. They were recognized as individual agents of change rather than anonymous functionaries. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Nakamura Sachiko, a clerk in the economic and scientific section, later recalled, when an American officer thanked me by name for catching an error in a document, I went home and wept. I was 25 years old, university educated, and it was the first time in my working life that my individual contribution had been acknowledged by a superior. I had existed before as a function translator, clerk, assistant. Now suddenly, I existed as Sachiko, as a person whose particular attention and intelligence had value. This pattern repeated across thousands of interactions. A female American military officer asking a Japanese secretary about the most effective way to reach rural women with public health information. A male American administrator requesting a Japanese translator's opinion on whether a proposed education reform would be culturally acceptable. A supply officer asking a Japanese clerk whether the distribution system for food aid could be improved. Each question represented a small revolution, a tiny crack in the monolithic wall of assumed female subordination. The presence of American military women intensified the effect. The Women's Army Corps personnel who arrived with occupation forces occupied positions of real authority. They wore officers' insignia. They gave orders to enlisted men. They supervised administrative sections. They drove vehicles, carried sidearms, made decisions that affected thousands of people. Two Japanese women who had been taught that female authority over men was unnatural and improper. The sight of a female American captain directing male sergeants seemed to violate cosmic order. Yet the world did not end. The Americans did not descend into chaos. In fact, two Japanese observers, American operations often seemed remarkably efficient, precisely because they drew on talent regardless of gender. A skilled female administrator was given administrative authority. A competent female analyst was tasked with analytical work. The idea that one should reject capable contributions simply because of the contributor's sex seemed, from the American perspective, obviously wasteful and irrational. Watanabe Kimiko, assigned as a translator to a Women's Army Corps lieutenant, experienced this most directly. She later wrote, Lieutenant Morrison treated me not as a Japanese woman, subordinate and humble, but as a professional colleague who happened to speak both English and Japanese. She asked my advice on everything from proper forms of address to the political reliability of local officials. When I suggested a different approach to a problem, she listened carefully and often adopted my suggestions. She introduced me to visiting officials as my essential colleague. I had never been essential before. I had never been a colleague. I began to understand that in America, Perhaps being female did not automatically make one insignificant. The transformation was not uniform or immediate. Many Japanese women, particularly older women, deeply invested in the traditional order, resisted these changes. They viewed American gender norms as dangerous, immoral, destructive of family harmony and social stability. The notion that women should speak their opinions seemed to them a recipe for chaos and conflict. Better the known constraints of traditional feminine roles than the terrifying freedom of individual agency, with all its attendant responsibilities and risks. Yet for younger women, especially those whose education had given them glimpses of alternative possibilities, the American approach opened doors they had not known existed. They began to imagine themselves not merely as wives and mothers' roles they still valued, but as citizens, as workers, as thinkers, as participants in the public sphere. They began to ask themselves questions they had never been permitted to ask. What do I want? What do I think? What could I become if given the chance? The most concrete manifestation of this shift came through the occupation's legal reforms. On October 11, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur issued the Civil Liberties Directive, followed shortly by specific instructions to the Japanese government to reform laws concerning women's rights. The Americans pushed for women's suffrage, equal education, workplace rights, and revision of the Civil Code to grant women's legal personhood independent of male guardianship. The Japanese government, still dominated by conservative men who had served under the militarist regime, resisted. The idea of granting women the vote seemed to them reckless and destabilizing. Women lacked political understanding, they argued. Women would vote as their husbands instructed, making the reform meaningless. Women's proper sphere was the home, not the polling place. These arguments had familiar echoes in American history, but they cut no ice with occupation authorities committed to democratization. On December 17, 1945, the Diet passed the revised election law granting women the vote. On April 10, 1946, Japanese women voted for the first time in a national election. 39 women won seats in the Diet, a higher percentage than in most Western democracies at the time. The sight of female legislators taking their seats in the national parliament, speaking in debates, casting votes on legislation, sent shockwaves through traditional Japanese society. But it was not just the high-profile legal changes that transformed women's consciousness. It was the accumulation of daily interactions where American authorities treated Japanese women as though their thoughts and opinions mattered. It was the gradual internalization of a different set of assumptions about human worth and capability. Suzuki Tomoko, a teacher recruited to work on education reform, described the process in a 1947 essay. At first, when the Americans asked my opinion, I believed they were testing me, trying to see if I harbored dangerous thoughts. I answered cautiously, saying what I thought they wanted to hear. But gradually, I realized they genuinely wanted to know what I thought, what I had observed, what I believed would work based on my experience. They were not seeking obedience. They were seeking knowledge that I possessed, and they did not. This realization changed everything. If I possessed knowledge valuable to them, then I was not merely a subordinate, but a resource, a colleague, a participant in our shared work. I began to speak more freely, to offer ideas unbidden, to argue when I disagreed. And they listened. They did not always agree, but they listened and considered and sometimes changed their plans based on what I said. I discovered that I had a voice, and that using it was not rebellion, but responsibility. This discovery that using one's voice was not rebellion, but responsibility represented a fundamental shift in consciousness. Under militarism, virtue for women had meant silence, obedience, subordination of self to collective need as defined by male authority. Now, virtue was being redefined as active participation, critical thinking, and individual contribution to collective welfare. The good woman was no longer the silent woman, but the thinking woman, the speaking woman. The woman who brought her full intelligence and experience to bear on the challenges facing her society. The symbolic weight of this shift concentrated particularly around moments when American officers specifically sought out women's perspectives on issues concerning women. When planning health clinics, Americans asked Japanese women what services they needed most. When reforming schools, Americans asked female teachers how girls had been educated and what changes were necessary. When establishing women's affairs bureaus in prefectural governments, Americans insisted that Japanese women be appointed to leadership positions and consulted on policy. This approach contrasted absolutely with Japanese militarist practice. Under the wartime regime, policies affecting women had been made entirely by men in bureaucratic offices who never asked women what they wanted or needed. Women's organizations existed, but they served to transmit government directives downward, not to carry women's voices upward. The idea that policy concerning women should be made with substantial input from women themselves was revolutionary. Tanaka Michiko, the translator we met at the beginning, found herself promoted to a liaison position specifically tasked with connecting American occupation authorities with Japanese women's groups. In this role, she attended meetings where American officers, male and female, repeatedly asked her to explain what Japanese women wanted, what they needed, what they feared, what they hoped for. She was asked to conduct surveys, to organize focus groups, to solicit written comments from women across the prefecture. In her diary from March 1946, she wrote, "Today I presented survey results to Colonel Henderson and his staff. 300 women responded to questions about education, employment, and family law reform. I had expected the colonel to glance at the report briefly and then tell me what policy would be. Instead, he read it carefully, asked probing questions about the methodology, and then said, 'Based on this data, what would you recommend?' I was struck speechless. He was asking me to recommend policy, me, a Japanese woman, to an American colonel, on policy affecting millions. I stammered something inadequate. He smiled and said, 'Think about it tonight. Tomorrow, I want your professional recommendation based on this data you've gathered. You understand these women's needs better than I ever could. Professional recommendation.' As though I were a professional, as though my judgment had weight. That night, Michiko did not sleep. She sat at her low table with the survey results spread before her, and for the first time in her life, she thought about policy as something she could influence, something she could shape. She was being asked to think not as a subordinate awaiting orders, but as an expert with knowledge and judgment that mattered. The responsibility terrified her. It also exhilarated her in ways she had never experienced. Her recommendations for women's literacy programs, for legal aid clinics, for training programs in non-traditional skills were largely adopted. She saw her ideas become policy. She saw programs she had helped design come into existence. She felt, for the first time, the peculiar satisfaction of democratic participation, the sense that one's voice had contributed to the collective direction of society. This pattern of consultation, of asking women's opinions and taking them seriously, rippled outward beyond the immediate sphere of occupation administration. Japanese women who experienced this treatment in their work with Americans began to expect it elsewhere. They began to question why Japanese institutions, universities, corporations, government agencies did not similarly solicit their input. They began to demand a voice. The symbolism of the question, "What do you think?" became a kind of talisman, a marker of respect and recognition. Women who had been asked their opinions by American authorities began asking that question of other women. Teachers began asking female students not just to memorize information, but to analyze and evaluate it. Mothers began asking daughters not just to obey, but to explain their reasoning. Wives began, tentatively and with great trepidation, to suggest to husbands that their opinions on household decisions might matter. This was dangerous territory. The traditional household remained deeply hierarchical, with the husband's authority close to absolute. A wife who expressed opinions unbidden risked conflict, punishment, even divorce. Yet American legal reforms were changing the stakes. The revised Civil Code, implemented in 1947, granted women rights in marriage they had never possessed. They could own property separately. They could initiate divorce on grounds of abuse or abandonment. They were no longer legal minors under permanent male guardianship. The combination of legal change and shifting consciousness created new possibilities. Women who might once have endured unhappy marriages in silence now had alternatives. Women who might once have suppressed their thoughts now had examples. American women and increasingly bold Japanese women of female voice and agency. The transformation was uneven, contested, incomplete, but undeniably real. One symbolic manifestation appeared in the form of women's magazines and newspapers that emerged in the late 1940s. Publications like Fujin Keiron and Fujin no Tomo, which had existed before the war but under heavy censorship, now published articles by and for women that directly addressed questions of rights, education, work, and political participation. Letters to the editor poured in from women across Japan, describing their experiences with American employers who asked their opinions, sharing their confusion and excitement about this new treatment, debating what it meant for Japanese women's future. A letter published in Fujin Keiron in June 1946 captured the mood. I am a widow with 2 children, working as a translator for the occupation forces. Every day, the American officer I work for asks me questions. What do I think about this document? How would I approach this problem? What do Japanese women need most urgently? At first, I thought he was mocking me. No Japanese supervisor had ever asked my opinion on anything beyond where to file papers. But he was serious. He genuinely wanted to know what I thought. It has been 6 months now, and I have stopped waiting for the trap to spring. This is simply how he works, how the Americans work. They believe my thoughts have value. I am beginning to believe it too, and it is the strangest, most frightening, most wonderful feeling I have ever known. The fear was real and justified. To claim one's own voice was to step outside the protection of traditional roles. A woman who spoke her mind risked social censure, family conflict, economic precarity. Yet increasing numbers of women found the risk acceptable because the alternative returning to voicelessness had become intolerable once they had experienced being heard. The Americans, for their part, were not always consistent or enlightened in their treatment of Japanese women. Occupation forces included their share of men who held conventional views about women's roles, who treated Japanese female employees with condescension or harassment. Racial prejudice complicated gender dynamics, with some American men viewing Japanese women as exotic subordinates rather than professional equals. The occupation's record on gender equality was mixed at best, yet even imperfect. American practices represented a dramatic improvement over Japanese militarist norms. An American officer who asked a Japanese woman's opinion once a week was infinitely more progressive than a Japanese system that never asked at all. An American workplace that occasionally promoted capable women was revolutionary, compared to a Japanese system that categorically barred them from advancement. The comparison was not between American perfection and Japanese failure, but between American inconsistency and Japanese systematic suppression. What mattered most was not that Americans always lived up to their democratic ideals, but that those ideals existed and were explicitly articulated as goals. When Americans fell short, Japanese women increasingly had vocabulary to point out the shortfall. The concept of equal rights, once introduced and legitimated by the occupation authorities, became a standard that could be used to critique not just Japanese practices, but American ones as well. By 1948, Japanese women who had worked closely with occupation forces were beginning to organize independently to push for further reforms. The Women's Democratic Club, the League of Women Voters of Japan, and numerous other organizations emerged, led by women who had discovered their voices through occupation work and were determined to keep using them. These organizations lobbied for better education, workplace protections, childcare support, and political representation. They published newsletters, held rallies, and pressured the Diet for progressive legislation. The transformation was incomplete and contested. Conservative forces pushed back hard, arguing that American-style gender equality was foreign to Japanese culture and destructive of family harmony. Many women, especially in rural areas and older generations, remained committed to traditional roles and skeptical of feminist reforms. The women's movement itself was divided between moderate reformers and more radical activists. Progress was uneven and frustratingly slow. Yet something fundamental had changed and could not be fully reversed. A generation of Japanese women had experienced being asked their opinions, being treated as thinking individuals, being recognized as citizens with rights and agency. They had tasted participation in the public sphere, and they would not willingly retreat entirely into silence and subordination. The question, "What do you think?" had opened a door that would never fully close again. Tanaka. Mikiko's personal trajectory illustrated the larger transformation. By 1949, she'd left her position with occupation forces to take a job with a Japanese women's organization focused on education reform. She organized workshops for female teachers, developing curricula that encouraged critical thinking rather than rote memorization. She advocated for girls' access to higher education and vocational training beyond domestic skills. She wrote articles for women's magazines about civic participation and democratic values. In 1950, she married late by traditional standards, and to a man she chose herself rather than accepting a family-arranged match. Her husband, a progressive journalist, supported her career. They had 2 children, but she continued working, negotiating a balance between family and professional life that would have been unthinkable before the war. Her mother disapproved of this arrangement, viewing it as a neglect of proper feminine duty. Her younger sister, inspired by her example, attended university and became a doctor in 1955. Michiko attended a conference on women's education where she met Lieutenant Morrison, the Women's Army Corps officer who had supervised one of her colleagues during the occupation. Morrison was visiting Japan as a private citizen, researching a book on occupation reforms. They spoke for hours, reflecting on the changes of the past decade. Morrison said, "When we first arrived, I wasn't sure Japanese women would accept our approach. Your culture seemed so different, so hierarchical. But I believed that the desire for dignity, for recognition, for voice, those are human universals." It turned out I was right. Michiko replied, "You were right about the desire. We had always had it. We simply had no language for it, no examples, no permission. You gave us permission, or rather, you treated us as though we already had it and need not ask. That made all the difference. You asked our opinions as though it was obvious that we had valuable opinions to offer. Eventually, we began to believe you." This exchange captured the essential mechanism of transformation. The Americans had not simply imposed new laws and walked away. They had, through thousands of daily interactions, modeled a different set of assumptions about human worth and capability. They had asked Japanese women's opinions, listened to their answers, and acted on their input. They had treated women as though they were intelligent, capable, and valuable contributors to collective welfare. And gradually, Japanese women had internalized this treatment, had begun to see themselves as the Americans saw them, and had begun to insist that Japanese society grant them the recognition, the Americans had offered. The symbolic power of the question, "What do you think?" lay precisely in its implication that the answer mattered. To ask someone's opinion is to acknowledge their perspective as potentially valid and valuable. It is to grant them epistemic authority over their own experience. It is to position them as participants in dialogue rather than objects of policy. For women who had spent their entire lives being told what to think and do without ever being asked what they themselves thought or wanted, this simple question represented a recognition of personhood, so fundamental that experiencing it for the first time felt like being born anew. Decades later, when scholars of the occupation came to assess its legacy, they often focused on constitutional reforms, economic restructuring, and the transformation of Japan into a peaceful democracy. These were indeed profound changes. But for the women who lived through the occupation, the most revolutionary aspect was often the smallest and most personal, the moment when an American in authority asked their opinion and waited, genuinely waited to hear their answer. That moment of being heard, of being recognized as a thinking individual worthy of consultation, planted seeds of change that would continue to grow long after the last occupation forces departed Japanese soil. The epilogue to this transformation came in 1960, when Tanaka Michiko was invited to speak at a women's college about the history of post-war reforms. She stood before 200 young women born after the war, women who had grown up with the vote, with access to higher education, with legal rights their mothers had never possessed. These young women took for granted what Michiko's generation had won through struggle and transformation. She told them about January 1946, about walking into that American headquarters, terrified and confused, about being asked her opinion for the first time in her life. She told them about the shock of recognition, the fear and exhilaration of discovering that her thoughts had value. She told them about the long, difficult process of learning to use her voice, of claiming authority over her own experience, of insisting on being heard. Then she said, "When I was your age, it was dangerous for a woman to speak her mind. It was transgressive. It was radical. But silence was more dangerous still, because silence meant erasure, meant complicity in your own subordination." The Americans asked us what we thought, and in answering them, we discovered ourselves. We discovered that we had thoughts worth expressing, knowledge worth sharing, perspectives that mattered. That discovery changed everything. Now you live in a Japan where women vote, where women attend universities, where women can own property and choose their husbands and work in professions. You take these things for granted, as you should. They are your birthright. But remember, they were not always so. Remember that your mothers and grandmothers fought for these rights, often simply by insisting on being heard, by refusing to return to silence once they had discovered their voices. The greatest gift the occupation gave us was not the laws they imposed, though those mattered. It was the mirror they held up, showing us a reflection of ourselves as thinking, capable, valuable human beings. Once we saw that reflection, once we understood that we could be citizens and not just subjects, individuals and not just functions, we could never fully unsee it. That vision has driven every advance since. So when you speak your mind, when you express your opinion, when you participate in your communities and your nation, remember that you are exercising a right that was not freely given, but hard-won. Remember the women who first answered when Americans asked, "What do you think?" Remember that using your voice is not just a right, but a responsibility, a trust passed down from those who gained it at great cost. And remember this: democracy does not survive through laws alone, but through the daily practice of treating one another as worthy of being heard. When you ask someone their opinion and truly listen to their answer, you perform an act of democratic faith. You acknowledge their personhood, their dignity, their value as a thinking individual. That simple act of asking and listening, that is the seed from which democracy grows. That is what the Americans taught us, sometimes without knowing they were teaching. That is what we must pass on to future generations. In the audience, young women listened, many of them unaware of how revolutionary these ideas had once been, how dangerous it had once been for a woman to speak. But a few understood, a few grasped the magnitude of the transformation Michiko described. They saw in her story a truth about power and voice, about oppression and liberation, about the ways that small acts of recognition can crack open entire systems of subordination. About the ways that small acts of recognition can crack open entire systems of subordination. One student approached Michiko after the lecture and asked, "When the colonel first asked your opinion, what did you say? What was your answer?" Michiko smiled, remembering that terrifying, exhilarating moment 15 years earlier. "I don't remember my exact words. I stammered something inadequate about women's education. What I said mattered less than the fact that I said anything at all." He had asked, and I had answered. That exchange, that dialogue between human equals, that was the revolution. Everything else followed from that. The student nodded, absorbing this. Then she asked, "And what do you think now? About women's roles, about democracy, about the future?" Michiko laughed. "You ask me what I think. Then you understand everything. You understand that asking itself is the point. That dialogue is the essence of democracy, that no one, no man, no authority, no tradition can speak for you if you have learned to speak for yourself. What I think is that Japan has changed profoundly, though not completely. What I think is that women of your generation must continue the work of claiming voice and space and recognition. What I think is that democracy is not a destination, but a practice, something we must do every day in every interaction. And the most democratic thing we can do is ask each other, genuinely and with open minds, what do you think? And then, listen, really listen to the answers we receive." This, finally, was the lasting legacy of those shocking moments when Americans asked Japanese women's opinions. Not just the legal reforms or the institutional changes, profound as those were, but the transformation of consciousness, the internalization of a new understanding of personhood and dignity. Japanese women discovered that they had voices worth hearing. And once discovered, that knowledge could never be fully forgotten. The question, "What do you think?" became an emblem of democracy itself. A reminder that legitimate authority rests not on unquestioned hierarchy, but on the consent and participation of thinking individuals, who are recognized as worthy of being consulted in the ruins of militarist Japan, among the ashes of empire and the rubble of cities. This simple question planted seeds of transformation that would bloom across generations. The women who first heard it and dared to answer began a conversation that continues still. A dialogue about rights and dignity, about voice and silence, about the terms on which human beings can live together in freedom. That conversation, more than any imposed law or institutional reform, was the true democratic revolution of occupied Japan, a revolution born in the moment when conquerors asked the conquered, "What do you think?" and waited, respectfully, to hear the answer.